Welcome to our channel, Crime Loom, the place where true crime stories come alive. From daring jewel heists to mysterious legends, every video uncovers the secrets hidden in the shadows. Stay with us, because here, every crime tells a story. In the heart of London, during a quiet Easter weekend, a group of aging thieves pulled off the most daring robbery the UK had ever seen. They weren't young rebels chasing glory, but old men who carried decades of experience in crime. Armed, with drills, patience, and nerves of steel, they broke into a vault thought to be impenetrable. What they found inside was beyond imagination, millions in diamonds, gold, and cash. But what made this heist truly unforgettable was not just the treasure they stole, but how close they came to escaping justice entirely. The streets of London were quiet on that cool spring night. Street lamps glowed with a dull yellow light, and the sound of a distant train echoed in the air. Most of the city slept, unaware that a group of men were preparing to change history. They were not young hotheads or reckless criminals. They were older, calm, and careful. Some were in their 50s and 60s, men who had spent their lives in and out of crime. This was not just another robbery. This was a heist planned for months, maybe even years, and it would soon be known as one of the most famous crimes in the United Kingdom. At the center of it all was an old man named Brian Reader. He was known in the underworld as the Master. He had been part of crimes in the past, and even though he was now in his 70s, his mind was sharp. He was quiet and polite, but behind his glasses and soft voice was someone who had spent a lifetime studying how to outsmart banks, guards, and alarm systems. He knew this job would be his last big one, the final crime before retirement. He wanted to leave a mark that no one could forget. Reader was not alone. Around him was a crew of men who were also veterans of the criminal world. There was Terry Perkins, an old thief who had spent more than 20 years in prison. Perkins walked slowly and looked frail, but when it came to crime, he was fearless. He was ready to take one last risk. Then there was Danny Jones, who loved the thrill of the job more than the money. He had white hair and a grin that never left his face. There were others, too, younger men who acted as drivers and helpers, but the brains were the old-timers. They called themselves old school, and they were proud of it. The place they had chosen was not an ordinary shop or a random bank. It was Hatton Garden Safe Deposit, a building in the heart of London's jewelry district. For decades, Hatton Garden had been a place where rich dealers and jewelers kept their most valuable items: diamonds, gold bars, cash, and precious watches filled the safety deposit boxes. The men knew that inside those walls was more wealth than they had ever seen in one place. To them, it was a treasure chest waiting to be opened. The plan began to take shape in Reader's living room. The men met in secret, sitting around cups of tea and old newspapers, talking in low voices about the vault and how it could be broken. They studied blueprints of the building, looked at maps of the area, and even practiced their moves. The key to everything was the vault door. It was thick, heavy, and almost impossible to open without the right tools. But the men had an idea. Instead of going through the front, they would drill through the wall beside the vault. It was risky, but it could work. Getting the tools was another challenge. They needed powerful drills, machines that could cut through solid concrete. They managed to get hold of Hilti drills, expensive equipment usually used by builders. These machines were loud and heavy, but if used correctly, they could make a hole big enough for a man to crawl through. The thought of it excited them. They imagined squeezing into the vault like soldiers entering a bunker, with riches waiting inside. When the Easter holiday came in April 2015, the city was quiet. Offices were closed, shops were shut, and the streets were empty. It was the perfect time to strike. The men wore workmen's uniforms, hard hats, and carried bags of tools. To anyone passing by, they looked like builders working late, but behind. The disguise was a daring plan that could have come straight out of a film. On the first night, they slipped into the building through a side entrance. Security cameras watched, but they moved calmly, not rushing, not panicking. They carried their drills and ropes down to the basement where the vault was. The smell of dust and concrete filled the air as they set up their machines. One by one, they drilled into the wall, the noise echoing through the empty building. Hours passed, sweat dripped down their faces, but slowly a hole began to appear. The men laughed quietly to themselves. They were doing it. The impossible was becoming possible, but it was not smooth. The wall was tougher than they thought. The drill bits broke, sparks flew, and the machines grew hot. At one point, they had to stop and replace the equipment. Some of the men argued, their tempers flaring in the heat of the basement. Yet, they kept going. They had come too far to give up. Finally, after hours of work, there was a gap wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Danny Jones was the first to crawl in. He slid on his stomach, flashlight in hand, and when he stood up, he was inside the vault. In front of him stood rows of metal safety deposit boxes, each one hiding treasures worth millions. One by one, the others followed him inside. The smell of money and old leather filled the air. They pulled out crowbars, drills, and hammers and began to smash open the boxes. The sound of metal cracking echoed in the vault. Behind the doors were bags of diamonds, stacks of cash, and piles of gold. The men's eyes widened. It was everything they had dreamed of. They filled their bags, stuffing them with whatever they could find. Each man worked fast, like children in a candy store. They laughed, joked, and cheered. For that moment, they were kings, but time was against them. They knew alarms might still go off, and they could not stay too long. After hours of looting, they carried their bags back through the hole and into the basement. The weight was heavy, but the joy was greater. They loaded the loot into wheelie bins, the kind you see outside houses. To the outside world, it looked like trash being taken out. In reality, those bins were filled with millions in jewels and cash. By the time the sun began to rise, the men were gone. The building stood silent, the vault torn apart, the boxes empty. London woke up to a normal morning, but something extraordinary had happened while it slept. The Hatton Garden safe deposit had been robbed, and no one had stopped it. The men drove away, tired but thrilled, unaware that their names would soon be in every newspaper. To them, it was the perfect job, the heist of a lifetime. The morning after the robbery, the building staff came back to work as usual. They walked through the halls of Hatton Garden, unaware of the scene waiting in the basement. The smell of dust still hung in the air, and the vault door stood tall and untouched, as if nothing had happened. But the hole in the wall told a different story. When the workers looked inside, their mouths dropped open. The deposit boxes were smashed, their doors bent and twisted, and papers and broken locks lay scattered across the floor. It was chaos. The vault that was once trusted by London's richest dealers had been stripped bare. Word spread quickly. Police cars arrived and detectives crowded around the vault. They stared at the hole in the wall, the scattered tools, and the empty boxes. Some shook their heads in disbelief. How had anyone managed to pull this off? The alarms had not called the police in time. The cameras had caught shadows, but nothing clear enough to stop the crime. It was as if ghosts had entered the building, taken the treasure, and vanished without a trace. But they were not ghosts. They were 6 or 7 men, old but sharp, and they were sitting quietly in their homes that morning, drinking tea and reading newspapers. Some of them smiled at the headlines. They knew it was only a matter of time before the press called it the heist of the century. For now, they were safe. The loot was hidden, and their names were not known. To them, the hardest part was over, or so they thought. In truth, the heist had not gone as smoothly as they had hoped. On the first night, their drill had broken down, and they had been forced to leave the building without finishing the job. They came back the next night, slipping in once more, hoping no one had discovered their attempt. It was dangerous, but luck was on their side. No one had checked the basement, and they were able to complete the drilling. That risk haunted them now. They knew the police would be searching every camera, every car, every street around Hatton Garden. The men trusted their disguises, but doubt still lingered. Brian Reeder, the so-called master, felt both proud and uneasy. He had spent his life in crime, but this was different. This job was so big, so famous, that the police would not stop until they caught someone. He tried to calm himself, telling the others to lay low and avoid showing off their new wealth. But keeping thieves away from spending was never easy. Some of the younger helpers wanted their share quickly. They had bills, families, and debts. They whispered about dividing the loot, but Reeder urged patience. "We wait until the heat cools," he told them. "Rushing will get us caught." Meanwhile, the police investigation grew. Detectives combed through hours of CCTV footage. They found blurry images of men in hard hats walking in and out of the building with wheelie bins. At first, it looked ordinary, like builders clearing rubbish. But the timing matched the nights of the heist. Investigators began to piece it together. Someone had planned this carefully. They had used powerful drills, brought in heavy tools, and carried away millions under everyone's nose. The more the police studied it, the more they realized this was no group of amateurs. These were professionals. Back in their safe houses, the gang met in secret. They discussed how to handle the stolen goods. The diamonds, gold, and cash were worth more than $14 million, a fortune that could set them up for life. But with great wealth came great risk. Selling diamonds on the street was not easy. They needed connections, fences who could turn stolen gems into clean money. The older men had those contacts, but they also knew every call and every meeting could be watched. Tension began to build inside the group. Greed and mistrust grew. Some wanted their share right away, while others wanted to wait. Danny Jones, the man with the white hair and playful grin, could not stop talking. He loved to brag, and he loved the thrill. To his friends, he made jokes about crawling into the vault like a soldier. He told them about the glitter of the diamonds and how heavy the gold felt in his hands. At first, it was just talk among thieves, but soon his chatter reached the wrong ears. Loose words in the criminal world could travel fast, and the police had informants everywhere. Every careless sentence was another thread leading back to the gang. One of the most reckless moments came when the men returned to their favorite pub. They sat around, drinking and laughing, toasting to their success. To anyone watching, they looked like old men enjoying a night out, but in reality, they were celebrating one of the biggest robberies in British history. Hidden microphones and silent eyes could have caught them at any time. They did not realize that detectives were already narrowing the circle, already hunting for older criminals who might have the skills to pull off such a daring act. Detectives began looking at known names. They dug into old case files, searching for anyone with a record of robberies and drilling into vaults. Brian Reeder's name appeared again and again. He had been involved in famous crimes decades earlier. Terry Perkins also had a long record, as did Danny Jones. The investigators could not ignore the pattern. It was almost as if history had repeated itself. The same men who had once filled the newspapers with their crimes were now back, older but still daring. But the police had a problem. There was no direct evidence yet. The CCTV showed shadows. The tools left behind had no clear fingerprints, and the vault gave away no names. To make an arrest, they needed stronger proof. They decided to follow the suspects, watching their movements day and night. Teams of officers sat in unmarked cars, waiting outside houses, noting every visitor, every meeting. Slowly, a picture began to form. The men were being tracked, even though they did not yet know it. While the police watched, the gang tried to divide the stolen goods. Arguments broke out. Some accused others of taking more than their share. Others feared the police were already close. Voices were raised and trust began to crack. The perfect heist was no longer perfect. It was turning into a struggle of greed and fear. What had started as a brotherhood of old criminals was becoming a storm of suspicion. They had beaten the vault, but could they beat their own mistakes? The city of London continued as normal. Office workers filled the streets, buses roared past, and tourists walked through the jewelry shops of Hatton Garden. Yet behind the scenes, a massive hunt was underway. The newspapers called it the boldest robbery of the century. Families who had lost their jewels cried out for justice. Politicians demanded answers. And in small houses and hidden rooms, the gang sat with bags of diamonds and piles of cash, unsure whether they had won or whether the clock was ticking toward their capture. The weeks after the heist were filled with tension. The gang had thought the hardest part was behind them, but in truth, the danger had only begun. They had stolen millions, but millions were not easy to hide. Diamonds had to be sold, cash had to be cleaned, and gold had to be melted. Every move they made carried the risk of exposure. The older men, like Reeder and Perkins, told the others to stay calm and wait. But younger members of the team grew restless. Waiting meant no money in their hands, and their patience began to crack. Brian Reeder, the man who had led the plan, felt his nerves wearing thin. He had been in the game for decades and knew how police investigations worked. He told himself that silence and caution were their only chance. But silence was something the group struggled with. Danny Jones, with his constant jokes, could not keep quiet. He told stories to friends about how he had crawled through the vault hole and seen diamonds shining in the dark. Every time he laughed, every time he spoke too freely, he put the whole team at risk. The police, meanwhile, were moving slowly but carefully. Detectives followed the trail of broken drills and other tools left behind. They studied the CCTV footage, watching the blurry figures in hard hats pushing wheelie bins through the night. They could not see faces, but they could see body shapes and the way men walked. One detective pointed out that one figure walked with a limp, something that matched an old injury of Terry Perkins. Another investigator noticed how one man moved with the slow stiffness of age, just like Brian Reeder. Piece by piece, the shadows began to look familiar. Surveillance teams spread out. They parked near houses, blending into the streets, watching for suspicious visitors. They saw older men meeting late at night, talking in parked cars, moving heavy bags from one place to another. They could not yet prove what was inside those bags, but they suspected. The more they watched, the more confident. They grew that they had found the right men, but the police knew rushing in too early could ruin the case. They needed patience, the same patience the criminals lacked. Inside the gang, greed was poisoning trust. The loot was supposed to be shared fairly, but arguments broke out. Some men believed others had hidden extra gems or cash. Voices rose. Fists almost flew, and friendships began to collapse. Perkins accused Jones of running his mouth. Jones mocked Perkins for being weak. The younger helpers demanded quicker payment. Brian Reeder watched it all and realized the team was falling apart. The unity that had pulled them through the vault wall was breaking down. The perfect crime was slowly becoming a mess. At the same time, the police gathered more evidence. They placed listening devices in cars, tracking devices under vehicles, and tapped phones. The men did not know they were being recorded. They spoke freely about the heist, using nicknames and half-sentences, but the meaning was clear. Detectives listened to Jones bragging about the hole in the vault. They heard Perkins complain about his share. They even heard plans about selling some of the gems. Every word added another brick to the case. The police were building a wall of evidence, and the gang was helping them. Still, the arrests did not come quickly. The police wanted to catch as many men as possible and recover as much of the loot as they could. Weeks turned into months, and the public began to wonder if the criminals had truly vanished. Newspapers called it the mystery of Hatton Garden. Talk shows joked about how a group of old men had outsmarted the entire system. Some even called them heroes, comparing them to characters from heist films. The public laughed, but the victims of the robbery were not laughing. Jewelers had lost their life savings, families had lost heirlooms, and trust in the vault was shattered. For them, justice could not come soon enough. Brian Reeder tried to keep a low profile. He rarely left his home and avoided flashy spending. But the others were not so careful. Jones bought drinks for friends, hinting about his sudden wealth. Perkins met shady contacts, whispering about selling gold. The younger helpers flaunted new cars and clothes. It was enough to draw attention. The police tightened their net. Surveillance teams captured photos of men meeting in car parks, loading bags into vans, and leaving at odd hours. Bit by bit, the walls closed in. One night, detectives followed Jones as he drove across town. He parked near a warehouse and met another man. The two carried a heavy bag inside. When they came out, the bag was lighter. The detectives smiled. They knew they had just witnessed stolen loot being moved. They did not yet act, but they noted every detail, building their case stronger. Later, they found the bag inside the warehouse. Inside were tools and bits of jewelry. It was another piece of proof that tied the men to the crime. Among the group, fear began to grow. Some of the men sensed the police were close. They became paranoid, looking over their shoulders, changing routes home, and checking their mirrors for tails. Others dismissed the fear, saying the police had nothing solid. But deep down, each man knew time was running out. They had taken too much, spoken too much, and argued too much. The dream of a perfect escape was fading. In the heart of London, the Hatton Garden building remained a scarred reminder of the crime. Tourists walked past, pointing at the famous vault, while shopkeepers shook their heads at the memory. The robbery had embarrassed the authorities and shocked the city. And yet, the criminals were still free. For the gang, each day of freedom felt like a gift. But for the police, each day was another step closer to the final strike. The turning point came when detectives finally had enough recordings and surveillance notes to convince the courts. They prepared warrants and planned simultaneous raids. They wanted to strike fast, before the men could vanish or destroy evidence. The old thieves, who thought they had beaten the system, had no idea that doors would soon be kicked in and their names splashed across every newspaper in Britain. But even then, not everything would go as planned. The arrests would reveal more secrets, more betrayals, and even more mysteries. The Hatton Garden heist was far from over. For the men who had drilled into the vault, the true test was only beginning. They had stolen millions, but could they keep their freedom? Or would age, greed, and mistakes drag them down at last? The sun rose quietly over London on the day the police were ready. In small offices and parked cars, detectives checked their notes one last time. They wore plain clothes and spoke into radios with calm, steady voices. They had spent weeks watching, listening, and waiting. Now the plan was set. At the same time, at different addresses, doors would open, and the old thieves would be taken by surprise. The aim was to catch them before they could hide the remaining loot or warn each other. The team leaders counted down the minutes, and every officer knew exactly where to go. At Brian Reeder's street, an unmarked car rolled to a stop. Officers stepped out and walked quickly, almost casually, to his front door. They knocked, called his name, and then entered with a practiced motion. Reeder stood in the hallway in a dressing gown, his face calm but pale. He had the look of a man who knew this day might come. The officers read him his rights while others searched the house. They were gentle but firm, moving through rooms, opening drawers, lifting floorboards where needed. Reeder watched in silence. He did not argue. He did not beg. He simply nodded, as if a long story had reached the chapter he expected. Across the city, another team reached Terry Perkins. He answered the door slowly, his eyes narrow and tired. He tried to act confused, but the act did not last long. The officers showed him a warrant, and he stepped back, letting them in. His kitchen table held a mug of tea and a folded newspaper covered with stories about the heist. The officers exchanged glances. They searched cupboards and a garden shed. They photographed tools, notes, and a lockbox with small items that sparkled under the strip light. Perkins sat down, hands shaking a little, but his voice steady. He asked for his medication. They let him take it with water, then led him to the car. The team that went after Danny Jones moved with extra care. Jones was talkative and unpredictable, and the officers expected surprises. They found him in a flat that smelled faintly of oil and metal. On the floor were bags, some empty, some heavy, and a small torch that still had dust on it. Jones tried to make a joke as they cuffed him, saying he had been planning a fishing trip and needed new tackle. No one laughed. A detective pointed at a marked tool case, the same brand used in the vault. Jones fell quiet, the grin fading from his face. By mid-morning, the police had several men in custody and a growing pile of evidence. Vans rolled back to a central site where items were tagged and logged. Officers laid out drills, ropes, masks, gloves, and discs cut from the vault wall. They placed small bags with diamonds next to envelopes of cash and a few heavy bars that gleamed through clear plastic. Every piece told part of the story. The case that had looked like a mystery in the first week now looked like a long, careful line of proof. In the interview rooms, the air felt thick and still. A clock ticked. A tape machine clicked on. Detectives asked simple questions in a quiet tone. Where were you on the Easter weekend? Who did you meet? How did you get these tools? The older men were used to this dance. They gave limited answers, sometimes none at all. They asked for lawyers. They asked for breaks. But even without long speeches, the tapes caught small things: a slip of the tongue, a nervous laugh, a half-finished sentence that matched the surveillance recordings. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. Lawyers arrived in dark suits and carried folders. They spoke of mistakes in procedure, of weak CCTV, of tools that many people could own. They reminded the detectives that suspicion was not proof. They were right about the rules, and the police respected that. But the detectives also had hours of recordings from cars and rooms, maps of movements, and photos of meetings in car parks. They had messages that spoke in code about boxes and holes, and they had men who matched the shapes and gaits from the night of the heist. The case was not a single nail. It was a box of nails, each one driving the story deeper. News spread fast. Cameras waited outside stations and courts. Reporters spoke about the age of the suspects, with a mix of shock and humor. Headlines called them the Diamond Geezer Gang and the Old School Crew. Some people on the street smiled as if it were a movie come to life. But for the victims who had trusted the vault, it was still painful. They watched the news and wondered if their family rings, their business funds, their saved gold would ever come back. Many items would never return. They had been split, melted, or lost in the dark maze of the black market. When the case reached court, the public benches filled quickly. The men were led in, older than the usual defendants, faces lined, shoulders slightly bent. The judge looked over his glasses with a serious gaze. The prosecution began with a steady voice, laying out the timeline. He spoke of Easter quiet, of drills and dust, of a hole in a wall where a vault should have been safe forever. He showed the jury photos of the scene, the neat circle cut through concrete, the wrecked boxes, the trail of debris. He played audio, clips that caught rough voices talking about going back in and getting the bins out. The jurors listened closely, some frowning, some taking notes. The defense tried another picture. They suggested that old men could not have done such heavy work. They argued that the CCTV was unclear, that voices on recordings were hard to identify, that tools were common, and that everyone deserved doubt. They spoke of health problems, of slow hearts and weak knees. They said the police had chased a story and forced the facts to fit it. It was a careful effort, and in some moments the jury looked uncertain. But the steady drum of evidence continued, and the jurors could see how the pieces locked together like the tumblers of a safe. During breaks, the men sat quietly with their lawyers. Reader's calm never left him. Perkins stared at the floor and tapped his fingers on his knee. Jones looked around the room as if searching for a way to turn the scene into a joke and could not find one. They had once felt like kings in a hidden vault. Now they were old sailors in a court's bright light, and the tide had turned. The verdicts, when they came, landed with a soft wave of murmurs from the benches. Guilty on key counts for the main men. There were nods, stiff backs, and whispers. The judge spoke of planning, of damage, of the harm done to trust and trade. He spoke of the boldness and the care with which the crime was planned. He spoke also of age, and how age did not erase responsibility. Sentences fell in measured tones. Years were counted out. Pens scratched on paper. The court clerk read the final words, and the men were led away. Outside, cameras flashed again. Some reporters asked if this was the end of the story. But it was. Not fully. A large part of the loot had never been found. Diamonds had vanished into the world. Gold had taken new shapes. Cash had been broken into smaller rivers and poured into the cracks of the city. The police had done much, but not everything could be recovered. That truth stayed like a shadow at the edge of every headline. The men had not gotten away in the way they dreamed, not with clean hands and quiet retirement. Yet parts of the treasure had slipped through the net, and that was a kind of escape, the kind that leaves questions behind. In the evenings that followed, London looked the same as it always had. Buses hummed, shop signs flickered, and the Hatton. Garden streets filled again with buyers and sellers, but under the surface, people spoke in lower voices about locks, about alarms, about trust. The heist had not just stolen jewels, it had stolen a sense of safety from a place built on safety. And still, in small rooms far from the court, an envelope would change hands, or a stone would be shown under a lamp, and someone would say, very softly, that it might be from that famous job. The story lived on, not only in files and news clips, but in whispers and in the glitter of things that no longer had a clear past. For the gang, prison walls closed around routines of quiet days. The men who once cut through concrete now queued for meals and counted steps in small yards. They spoke sometimes of the planning and the drilling and the first rush of dust when the wall opened. They spoke less about the arguing and the mistakes. Each man carried his own version of what had happened, polished like a stone in a pocket. They had tried to write an ending where they disappeared with a fortune. Instead, they had written a lesson that others would read, that even the perfect plan bends under the weight of time, talk, and pride. Would they have done it differently if given the chance? Some said yes, some said no, and some said nothing at all. What they all knew, though, was simple. The vault had kept its promise to no one that Easter. Not to the people who filled it with treasure. Not to the men who broke into it with old hands and steady patience. The city remembered, the courts recorded, and the rest of the story drifted into the spaces where facts become legend. And in those quiet spaces, the question remained like a soft knock on a closed door. How much did they truly get away with, and how much did they only think they did? The prison gates closed behind the men, and for the first time in years, they were not free to move as they wished. Their world shrank to small cells, locked doors, and long corridors that echoed with footsteps. For Brian Reeder, the oldest of them, it felt like the end of a long road. He had dreamed of retiring after the heist, sitting quietly with money in the bank and no more risks. Instead, he sat on a hard bed with plain walls and guards watching his every step. He had outsmarted a vault, but he had not outsmarted time. Terry. Perkins faced a different struggle. His health was weak, and prison life was harsh. The cold mornings, the bland meals, and the long days wore him down. He tried to keep his pride, reminding himself that he had been part of something historic, something people would talk about for years. But when the lights went out at night and the halls grew silent, the weight of his choices pressed hard on him. He had chased one last thrill, and it had cost him the rest of his freedom. Danny Jones, the man who loved to laugh, still tried to keep spirits high. He cracked jokes with guards and told fellow inmates about the big job that had shaken London. Some listened with awe, others with envy, and some with suspicion. Jones enjoyed the attention, but inside he knew the laughter was thin. He missed the rush of the job, the sound of drills biting into concrete, the first sight of diamonds glittering in the beam of his torch. Prison was dull compared to that. He often asked himself if the thrill had been worth the price. Outside the prison walls, life moved on. Londoners filled the streets, buses rolled past, and shops reopened in Hatton Garden. But the robbery was still fresh in people's minds. Journalists wrote long articles, documentaries replayed the story, and filmmakers began to plan scripts. The image of old men in hard hats pulling off a daring vault job became a strange mix of crime and comedy for the public. Some saw them as clever rogues. Others saw them as selfish thieves who ruined lives. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between the two. The police, though proud of the arrests, still faced frustration. A large part of the stolen fortune had never been found. Millions in jewels and cash were missing, and no one could say where they had gone. Had they been hidden in safe houses, smuggled out of the country, sold quietly in small deals across London? The detectives had their theories, but no solid proof. Every missing stone and bar of gold was a reminder that the case was not fully closed. Families who had lost their valuables tried to move forward. Some were compensated through insurance, but money could not replace heirlooms passed down for generations. A grandmother's wedding ring, a father's watch, a collection of coins saved for decades. Many of these were gone forever. Victims gave interviews on television, their voices shaking as they described the pain of loss. They did not laugh at the gang's age or the cleverness of the plan. To them, the men were not heroes. They were robbers who had taken pieces of their history. In quiet corners of the city, whispers continued about the loot that was still out there. A diamond passed from hand to hand in a back room. A bag of gold melted and reshaped into plain bars. A handful of cash traded in silence. The treasure of Hatton Garden had been broken into smaller rivers, and those rivers slipped into the shadows, where the law could not easily follow. For the gang, even behind bars, that knowledge gave a kind of bitter comfort. They had lost their freedom, but not all of the fortune had been lost with them. For Brian Reeder, time in prison moved slowly. He read books, walked in circles in the yard, and thought about his past. He remembered younger days of robberies and escapes, of long nights planning and longer nights running. He knew the Hatton Garden heist would be the last great job of his life. In some ways, he felt proud that he had been part of history, but he also knew that history would remember him not as a master, but as a thief who had been caught. Terry Perkins struggled more with each passing day. His health declined, and he often needed medical attention. Guards and inmates alike could see the toll it was taking. Some whispered that he would never leave prison alive. Perkins himself knew it too. He had gambled everything on one last job, and the gamble had failed. The thought haunted him as he lay awake in the dark, listening to the distant clang of doors. Freedom had been just within reach, and then it had slipped away forever. Danny Jones tried to keep his spark alive. He told the story of the vault again, and again, as if repeating it kept the memory fresh. But sometimes, when he was alone, the smile faded. He thought about the moment they had crawled through the hole, the moment when the vault was theirs, the moment when they felt untouchable. That moment was gone now, locked behind bars with them. No story, no joke, no laugh could bring it back. Outside, the legend of the heist grew. Tourists visited Hatton Garden, pointing at the building and taking photos. Guides spoke of the daring old men who drilled through concrete and carried out millions in bins. The city turned crime into spectacle, as it often did. But in the quiet, rooms of victims, the story was not a spectacle. It was a wound that never fully healed. As the years passed, some of the men faded into the background. Their names were less often in the papers, their faces less often on screens. They became part of the past, another chapter in London's long history of crime. Yet the story never truly ended. The missing loot kept it alive, like embers that refused to die. People still asked how much had been hidden, how much had been sold, and who might still hold pieces of the treasure. Those questions gave the tale its lasting power, a mystery that no sentence could erase. In prison yards, the men sometimes looked up at the sky, remembering freedom. They had taken on a vault, and for a while, they had won. But time, greed, and mistakes had caught them in the end. The walls around them were proof of that. Still, in their hearts, each man held on to the brief, shining moment when they had stood in the vault, surrounded by riches, feeling like kings. That moment, though, gone, could not be taken away. It was theirs forever, even as the world moved on. Time inside prison always seemed to stretch longer than it truly was. For the Hatton Garden men, days blended into one another until weeks passed like a slow crawl. They had once lived for planning, for risk, for action in the shadows. Now their lives were measured by meal times, head counts, and the steady clanging of iron doors. Yet even in confinement, the story of the heist followed them. Guards, fellow inmates, even strangers who had only heard the tale on the news whispered about them. Some admired their daring, some mocked their downfall, but all knew who they were. Brian Reeder, the so-called mastermind, tried to keep to himself. He was not young, and his body no longer had the strength it once did. He often sat quietly, reading or staring out of the small window in his cell. He thought about the night they drilled through the vault wall, the sparks flying, the dust filling the air. He thought about the sound of boxes breaking open and the sight of gold and jewels spilling out. Those memories were both sweet and bitter. Sweet because they had achieved what no one thought possible. Bitter because they had not held on to it for long. He told himself he had known the risks, but deep inside he wondered if it had all been worth it. Terry Perkins struggled more than most. His health continued to weaken, and prison was not a place for fragile men. He needed pills and checkups, but the cold air and hard routines took their toll. He had always been stubborn, always ready to take on risk, but now his body betrayed him. Some nights he lay awake coughing, his chest heavy, while the rest of the prison slept. Other inmates noticed and spoke quietly about him, some with pity, some with cold judgment. Perkins had chosen this path, and now he was paying its price. Danny Jones still tried to bring humor to the bleak halls. He told the story of crawling through the hole so many times that other inmates could repeat it word for word. He laughed about the wheelie bins full of riches and about the look on their faces when the vault opened like a treasure chest. Yet beneath the jokes was a man who felt the weight of regret. He had dreamed of freedom with pockets full of diamonds, not of growing old behind locked doors. Still, he carried himself with a grin, as if refusing to let prison crush his spirit entirely. The younger helpers of the gang fared differently. Some of them blended into prison life more easily, chatting with others, finding their way through the routines. But they too carried the mark of the heist. Their names would always be tied to it, and wherever they went, the shadow of Hatton Garden followed. Some felt pride in that, others shame. They had thought the job would change their lives, and it had, but not in the way they imagined. Outside the prison, the public fascination with the robbery did not die. Books were written, shows were filmed, and newspapers returned to the story, again and again. Each retelling painted the men in a slightly different light. Some stories described them as bumbling old men who had gotten lucky. Others portrayed them as clever masterminds, the last of a dying breed of old-school criminals. In living rooms and pubs, people argued about whether they were fools or legends. The truth, as always, was more complicated. They were both. Skilled and foolish, daring and reckless, successful and broken. The police, though satisfied with the convictions, remained frustrated by the missing fortune. Millions of pounds in jewels and cash were still unaccounted for. Some detectives believed it was hidden somewhere, waiting to be found. Others thought it had already been sold off in small pieces, scattered too far to recover. The unanswered question gave the story a mystery that would not fade. It was one thing to catch the thieves. It was another to trace every diamond, every bar of gold, every stack of cash. That part of the crime remained unfinished. Families who had trusted Hatton Garden never forgot the betrayal. Some never recovered their losses, and for them, the heist was not a tale of daring but a wound that cut deep. They had placed their trust in the vault, believing it was untouchable. The thieves had proven otherwise. No documentary or film could capture the heartbreak of losing a family jewel or a savings fund built over decades. For those families, the men were not folk heroes. They were simply criminals who had destroyed something precious. As the years passed, the men aged further. Wrinkles deepened, steps slowed, and voices grew weaker. Prison is a hard place for the young, but it is even harder for the old. Readers' health began to falter. Perkins, too, weakened with each passing season. Danny Jones still tried to tell jokes, but his body grew tired. Time was catching up with them in ways no sentence could. The very years they thought they could enjoy after the heist were being spent behind walls, their freedom traded for fame. Even so, the men often thought about the night of the heist. They remembered the moment when the vault door loomed in front. Of them, the excitement of breaking into the boxes, the laughter as they stuffed bags with treasures. In those hours they had felt alive, felt untouchable, felt like kings of the underworld. No prison could erase that memory. In their hearts, it was the one victory they still held on to. They had entered a fortress and walked out with riches. For that brief time, they had beaten the system. But memory is not freedom, and pride is not peace. Behind bars, they had plenty of time to wonder what might have been. If they had stopped sooner, been quieter, argued less, or planned more carefully, perhaps they could have escaped justice, or perhaps not. Age, pride, and greed had undone them as much as the police had. In the end, they had been betrayed not by alarms or guards, but by their own flaws. That truth sank deeper with every passing year. For the world outside, the story of the Hatton Garden heist became part of legend. It joined the list of great crimes that people told and retold, a mix of fact and myth. Some details blurred with time, but the core remained. A group of old men had drilled into a vault and stolen millions, right in the heart of London. Whether seen as fools or geniuses, they had written themselves into history. And history, unlike fortune, could not be hidden or spent. The years after the Hatton Garden heist settled into silence, but the story never fully faded. The men who had once stood in the vault were now older still, their bodies weaker, their steps slower. Some were moved between prisons, some spent more time in hospital wings than in cells, and some never made it out alive. Time, more than the law, became their final judge. Yet even as their days grew shorter, the tale of what they had done remained alive outside the prison walls. The robbery was retold so often that it became less of a crime and more of a legend in the eyes of many. Brian Reeder carried the weight of being called the mastermind. To him, the title was more of a burden than a prize. He had not wanted fame. He had wanted wealth and one last taste of victory. Instead, his name was printed in newspapers, repeated on television, and etched into court records. He thought about that night in the vault almost every day. The sound of the drill, the dust. In the air, the first glimpse of diamonds shining in his torchlight. It was burned into his memory. In those hours, he had felt like he had finally beaten the system. But prison walls reminded him every day that the victory had not lasted. Terry Perkins never saw freedom again. His health failed him, and the stress of prison life made it worse. Other inmates spoke quietly about how he was fading, and in time, news spread that he had died behind bars. For some, his death was the natural end for a man who had chased risk all his life. For others, it was a reminder of how age had played as much a part in the downfall of the gang as the police had. Perkins had gambled everything for one last thrill, and the gamble had ended not with riches, but with silence. Danny Jones kept telling stories for as long as he could. Even in prison, he made others laugh with his tales of the vault, the wheelie bins, and the moment he crawled through, the hole. But jokes could not change reality. The man who loved the thrill eventually grew tired too. He admitted to himself in rare quiet moments that he wished he had kept his mouth shut more often, wished he had been wiser, wished he had not let pride and laughter betray him. Still, he clung to the memory of those stolen hours of freedom when they had felt untouchable. To him, that memory was worth holding on to, even when everything else was gone. Outside, the public fascination continued. Films were made, turning the crime into entertainment. Books sold well, each offering new angles, new details, or sometimes new myths. Tour guides pointed out the Hatton Garden building to visitors, explaining how old men had managed to outsmart alarms and walk away with millions. Some called it the last great British heist. People smiled at the thought of pensioners pulling off a daring job, but few thought about the victims who had lost treasures that could never be replaced. The legend grew larger than the truth, as legends often do. The police, too, were never fully satisfied. They had caught the men and proven their case, but millions in loot were still missing. No one could say exactly where it had gone. Some believed it had been hidden and would one day be found. Others thought it had been smuggled abroad or broken, into smaller pieces that vanished into the shadows of the black market. The missing fortune became part of the myth. Every diamond that appeared in a quiet deal, every gold bar with an unclear history, every rumor of hidden cash stirred whispers. Could it be from Hatton Garden? For the victims, the years did not soften the loss. They spoke less in public, but the pain of what was taken never left. For them, the heist was not a legend. It was a scar. Their savings, their family jewels, their security, all had been broken apart in those Easter nights. While the world turned the gang into strange folk, heroes the victims carried memories of betrayal and grief. Their voices were quieter than the films and the headlines, but they were the truest part of the story. The men who survived long enough to be released walked out of prison not as rich masterminds, but as frail figures stepping into a world that had changed. Freedom did not bring back the years they had lost. It did not return the health they had spent or the trust they had broken. Some lived quietly, away from the spotlight, too tired to chase anything more. Others could not escape. The shadow of their past, as every neighbor, every stranger who recognized them, saw not a man, but a thief from a famous job. The world had remembered, and it would not forget. Yet the question lingered, whispered in pubs, written in articles, and spoken in interviews. Had they gotten away with it? The police had caught them, the courts had sentenced them, but the missing loot suggested another ending. Perhaps some of it had been hidden where no one would ever find it. Perhaps others had helped to move it, keeping their secrets safe. The men themselves never revealed the full truth. Even when pressed, even when, weakened by age, they held on to their silence. That silence kept the legend alive. For as long as the jewels and cash remained missing, people would always wonder. In the end, the Hatton Garden heist was not just about diamonds, gold, or cash. It was about pride, about risk, about the human desire to outsmart the system. It was about old men who refused to fade quietly and instead tried to make one last mark. They succeeded in making history, but history did not give them peace. It gave them prison, broken trust, and questions that would never fully be answered. And yet, in a strange way, they had achieved something too. They had carved their names into a story that would be told for generations. The streets of London still looked the same as they always had. People rushed to work, shops opened, and buses rolled past Hatton Garden. But to anyone who knew the story, the vault building was no longer just another place. It was a symbol, a reminder that even the safest walls can be broken, that even the most trusted vault can be opened, and that even the boldest thieves cannot fully escape the reach of time and consequence. The men had dreamed of leaving as legends with fortunes. Instead, they left as legends with questions. And so the tale of the Hatton Garden heist lived on. Not just in court records or newspaper clippings, but in whispers, in myths, in the glitter of a diamond with no past, in the weight of a gold bar with no clear source. The gang grew old, the loot remained scattered, and the city kept their memory alive. They had not truly gotten away, not in the way they wanted, but they had gotten away enough to keep the world wondering. And in that wonder, in that question mark that still hangs over London, their story found its final escape. You've just seen another chilling story from the world of true crime, but there are many more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to Crime Loom, and join us as we unravel more heists, mysteries, and untold legends. Don't miss what's coming next, because in the world of crime, the truth is always stranger than fiction.